Thank you for these presentations. It's really interesting because the three of you indeed sort of gave an overview rather than explaining sort of particular projects, and I think it fits very well to in the set of sessions that we have had. That probably this is the last one, and should be sort of seen as a stimulus for all of us, also the audience later on, to participate, to reflect on some of the issues that are happening. I want to go back to this issue of uncertainty, which you in fact mentioned. You initially were saying it's not part of your presentation, but you used the word uncertainty, and I would like to know a bit more how do you interpret this, and maybe I start with Bruce, since you didn't necessarily give a talk, but you have your own ideas, and I would add to this the notion of intuition, because that was mentioned. Because there's obviously sort of contradictory words. The fact that there's so much optimization involved, that the fact that there is a whole process of rationalization of processes and systems and connectivity and all sorts of terminology that implies that there's a very rational process behind it, when in fact there's an enormous amount of intuition that leads the work that is being done. On the other hand, I think uncertainty, if you get out of this room and ask somebody outside on the street what uncertainty means, there's a very negative connotation attached to it. Whereas I guess we all sort of see it as creative power, as, my goodness, that's where it's becoming interesting, because it's a whole group of aficionados of curiosity. Means if we know the recipe, it becomes uninteresting. If we don't know what the answer is, then it's fascinating, it's worth being here. And I pass my word to you, just to pick up on that.
So I think I'd like to talk about the seed of conception, and I think we keep coming back to this. We've talked about drawing, we've talked about the sort of hierarchy of structures of design, and how there's a sort of initial seed, and up until now, most of the projects we're looking at still are started, and they still generate from a sketch. And I know we're all trying to find tools to allow us to have instant feedback in that first instance, at that moment of conception, where we can have the complexity behind us so that we can make informed decisions and not naive decisions. And I think we're all striving for that, but I think we're quite a ways off. And I think, the sketch is still the sort of originator, and to displace the sketch, the uncertainty that I see is that we need to be clear as architects what the autonomous project is and what the core project is. And we might not all agree on what that is, but my concern is that if we don't define certain core autonomous projects that have existed in architecture in this fashion, in this common language, things are moving very quickly and we might lose them. We might not be able to get them back. And I know we're all very excited about the prospects, but there's a large portion of the discourse that can't engage with what we're talking about. And they feel very strongly and passionately about what they're interested in, which a lot of times has a social agenda, has a programmatic agenda, and we're trying hard, but it's often hard to get past the facade. And I'd really like to sort of open that up to think about how we can embed those tools in the first instance to ensure that we're informed. And that leads to a second part, and I'll stop after this, but is the uncertainty of the market. I mean, at the end of the day, clients don't like uncertainty, that's for sure. And contractors don't like uncertainty. And right now we're using the exception as the rule. We use practices that are clearly exceptions, and are given the luxury of exceeding program, exceeding budget, and making a lot of missteps. And I'm not saying that's occurring with examples that have been shown earlier, but generally it's sort of accepted that there's a risk taken. And I'm interested in the practice as a whole and enabling more architects the ability to have more time to design and a longer period of design and a more informed design process. So.
Sure. I think there's several really important and interesting points to that question. But the first, I think, you mentioned intuition. And one of the important bits about uncertainty is, as I think you were alluding to, as architects, we tend to try to want to try to justify by being certain, being able to quantify what is right about our drawings, our projects, to justify them to clients. And that's very different from the sort of notion of the expert designer who's developed an intuition over a lifetime of experience. We were having a conversation earlier about aesthetics, and the approach I take to aesthetics is that, well, you could say it's just about, it's a subjective opinion. I like the way that looks. But aesthetics has within it the notion that there's a lifetime of experience that allows you to judge whether something is right or not. And there may be all sorts of very rational, quantifiable things that are wrapped up in the aesthetics of the thing, but we just can't express them because it's too much. Now, when we try to sort of pull out the bits that we think are important and to quantify them, to justify them, we may be missing out on a whole lot of other things that are really important. I had a conversation with I won't mention any names, but software developers were looking at a package for doing urban analysis, and it quantified the distance to utilities, travel times, things like that, but it didn't have anything about social interaction. So someone using this package would think that they're designing a city and taking into account all the things that were really important, but missing out on the thing that was really important. And that leads to the other point that you mentioned, Bruce, about sketching. Because when we sketch, we are actually taking into account all sorts of things that have to do with our experience, and we may not be able to explicitly state what they are. And that's very important to acknowledge, I think. That these aren't necessarily about, they're not uncertainties in that sense, that someone actually knows what's going on, we just can't describe them.
I had an interesting professor, I think in late undergrad, who was asking all these questions about the analysis that we can add to urban design, all the different places and the spaces that we experience, and all the data that we can put in there. And the first question he asked me is, how are you representing the stories, the experiences of the people in the space? That's the type of thing that sits outside of the quantifiable range that we can represent. And this is where it kind of comes to an open thought that's been in my head as I've been thinking through this whole process, is the integration of either artificial intelligence systems, all sorts of different computing systems, ways of, taking large amounts of data, looking to recognize different types of pattern, give it either a quantitative or qualitative evaluation, lead to emergent-based systems. Where do you guys see that type of mix fitting into the practice of being a human being who still likes to sketch? The augmentation, the kind of integration of that aspect. I mean, Brady showed quite a few good examples of architects who have been bringing it in to take care of the very kind of hard aspects and to solve very finite known problems. But I'm trying to figure out at what point does this become something that frees us to really explore digital craftsmanship making of space?
Well, there's not necessarily an answer to your question, but I agree with your with you saying that uncertainty is good. I also think it's great because it triggers curiosity, but I would also like to pick up on what you said earlier in the introduction, that you had a student who had like 12 tutors and they were like guiding him to a thesis, and I think that's something we should consider as architects as well. Maybe we have to reconsider the role we play as architects. Maybe we have to start collaborating much more, and then that obviously changes maybe the way we deal with authorship. Maybe we really have to look at these phenomena that we find on the World Wide Web, like open source is one of the subtitles of this session as well. Like, this works perfectly and is so powerful because there's so many people like working on the same thing without one person being the author of this. And architecture still is this dictatorial idea of the architect having his vision and then he builds something that really stands there for a very long time, but obviously he cannot really estimate or think or predict what is going to happen in the future. And I don't think there's a shame in admitting that you cannot predict it. So why don't you just work together, and then you can also share the uncertainty.
I think that to me, there seems to be two different ways to talk about uncertainty here. One of them is an uncertainty about the profession and about what it's going to become. And the other is an uncertainty about a project and how a project is going to manifest itself. So I think in terms of the profession, and I know perhaps every generation thinks they're in a time of rapid change, but I think that it would seem to me that architecture is in a period of rapid change with the introduction of the digital. And what I was trying to suggest in my talk is perhaps we don't understand the ramifications of this change. We think perhaps it has to do with form, but it doesn't. It actually has to do with roles and responsibilities or something. We don't know yet. So there's this degree of uncertainty. There's also the degree of uncertainty with predicting a project and what that's going to be. And that has to do with simulation and optimization. And I think that with computational tools, we introduce techniques which we think will bring more certainty to the process. But it is debatable whether this does or not. In fact, when you look at the most sort of high technology simulations of weather and so forth, these actual programs that are written to simulate it are actually written with a high degree of intuition. They're not actually following the sort of scientific rigor which one would traditionally associate with that kind of scientific pursuit.
I would like to follow on of how you interpret this issue. You spoke about the future and ask you something about the increasing complexity that we're dealing with when one sort of goes back to Kevin Kelly and Out of Control, and he sort of makes the statement of the logic, the biologic, as being ultimately something that is going to interfere with everything we are going to design and do. Do you see this as part of this uncertainty process, which is that we are tending to a level of, and moving towards to a level of complexity that nature is sort of showing us without or knowing that we're actually not achieving exactly that, we are going to achieve something else. But also with the risks of what this implies, when we know that in nature and we are just starting to deal with the whole issues of environment can get out of balance, and it has a level of fragility which is quite extraordinary. So there seems to me that the part of the uncertainty is to do with the fascination that a higher degree of complexity is what we are aiming for. At the same time, there's a problem of vulnerability in the process that nature embeds that becomes a difficult issue to deal with, and particularly when you start dealing with behavior, performativity, and growth even, and the monitoring processes, maintenance, etc., that you have with those systems. I would like to sort of follow that and question you sort of where the future is lying in a way. Do you share that biologicalization of the future as being something that is not just something to do with the aesthetics, but in fact it has to do with other phenomena that deal with the notions of complexity that we are aiming for? You use the word ecology, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think bioinspiration is good. It's definitely worth looking at nature. I don't believe that that we can find every answer that we're looking for in nature, and we just have to look close enough. I don't think that's the fact. I really think that it's important to look at different disciplines, and what we're currently doing in architecture a lot is looking at computer science, for example. But I think we also have to look at other disciplines, at material science, at biology, chemistry, look at what these people are doing. And I think the role of the architect is always has been like that. I think more like a mediator. He's not really a specialist in any of these disciplines, but he has to know what is going on anywhere else in order to have an understanding or a knowledge of these things in order to bring them together. And therefore I think it's definitely worthwhile looking at nature, but not necessarily copying it.
I don't think there's any inherent limit to the kind of complexity we can deal with, at least I hope not, because if there is, we're in big trouble. But I think what you're getting on there is something fundamental to complex dynamical systems in general. I mean, you have a system, and depending on how you represent it, it might seem really complex and unpredictable, or at another level, it might actually seem like it has regularities. I mean, this is the case with all complex systems. It depends very much on the way that you represent it. So something like weather, for instance, we cannot predict the weather. We know that it's pretty much impossible to know exactly what the weather is going to be next week. But we know in general that the climate at a much larger level is predictable. And that's really what we have to build for as architects. We can actually deal with that level of complexity. We can assume that the climate in this particular location is the way it has always been for the past years. And obviously there's climate change on top of that, so that's another issue. But it depends very much on the level of resolution and the level of representation you're getting at. So I think that's that's the thing we really have to look out for. As architects, we can design for climate. We know that works. We just have to be very careful that any new kinds of systems that we're dealing with as we scale up the complexity of our projects or deal with projects in different parts of the world or whatever it might be, new technologies, that we understand that we're representing the system in a way that isn't going to have chaotic outcomes, but it's going to have relatively stable ones, and that's how we can deal with them.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the point you made about engaging other disciplines, and I think we tend to think that we can sort of go into other disciplines and sort of learn what they do and then bring it back into our own authorship and then somehow achieve the results we need. Sometimes we borrow code that's existing for other purposes and we repurpose it, and I think we have to move past that step, and I think we need to, the point you made about choreography or the architect as a mediator, I think we almost in some ways have to be a negotiation between whatever our core autonomous project is, however we just determine to decide what that is individually, and then we need to seek help and not be afraid to basically allow the experts in different fields to develop for instance, software further than we can, because I see it time and time again. We get into software. We try to get into software engineering. We masquerade as software engineers, and don't get me wrong. There's incredible work going on, but I think there is a lot of talent out there that we could actually be negotiating with and actually creating tools that are very specific to what we are trying to achieve. And I know there's many people in the audience that would say that, but I warn that I think keeping it in-house or trying to do it all ourselves is not going to lead us to tools that are fundamentally cohesive and fluid enough for us to actually use it in a way that, going back to my original point about the moment of conception, or the moment of actually truly dealing with the complexity and the ways that we want to deal with it.
I wanted to mention another point in a way, and then I guess we pass on to the audience, which is a phenomenon that quite a few people are sort of observing, which is when you go back again to the 20th century, you would clearly sort of differentiate the identity of the different offices, and Alan Pan sort of spoke a bit about this issue of the authorship of the individual and clearly this signature that the offices carried. But there is no doubt that there's a homogenization going on, whereby it's becoming increasingly difficult to identify whether the project that is going on, that is being submitted for a competition, is coming from a company or from another, or from one author or from another. And in fact, I've heard now from several colleagues who were juries in competitions saying, I thought we had a Zaha project winning, and it turned out to be Maxiano and Fuchsas. And there was a Foster project that looked like somebody else's project, etc., etc. And this extraordinary sort of level of potentials that's come from the tools and the knowledge that people in the offices have, that they share, and clearly smart geometry being one of these fora where there is not a moment of competition, it's a moment of sharing, also is bringing with it a danger of things becoming actually quite rather alike. Now, again, I think the notion of uncertainty, I think, is interesting in this. Is it the sense of certainty or uncertainty that we are playing with here? And how do you respond?
Sorry, I'll take this one. I think that's partly because the criteria for judging competitions is flawed. And I think this comes back to my point. If we're judging these competitions on envelope or form, then is that our project? Or is it more than that? And I think if we can define what that is, people will be more ready to judge us on those criteria. But we need to tell people what it is that criteria is. And I think a lot of things have been mentioned in the presentations are good starting points. And I think this, it's a moment of decision. I think it is a critical point for us in the profession.
Yeah, one probably minor point on this. I think that when we used to evaluate the drawing, when we used to evaluate the final product, I think there's a very clear way of saying, well, this is obviously of a style. And it's very different now that actually the communication that we have is not at the level of the drawings or the level of the building. It's actually, in many cases, at the level of the tools. There's an argument, obviously, that says the tools are going to dictate what you're going to do. But I think more than that, it's the fact that we're actually trading code and we're actually sharing the things that generate the building. We're using the same versions of that. That generates the buildings that tend to look stylistically the same. I don't think it's a stylistic thing in that sense. I think it's actually that we're just unable to evaluate or unable to anticipate the kinds of results we're going to get out of them. So we put a lot of faith in the tools and the code themselves rather than actually criticizing the final building.
Well, I mean, we're not the only discipline facing uncertainty. And I really think I would like to go back to this idea of cooperation and collaboration. And because, I mean, of course, these projects are highly speculative. They're experiments. They're not feasible for any really true architectural application yet. But nevertheless, all the collaborations that I had with material scientists in these kind of projects, they were really, really fruitful. And these people, although the materials they develop are not for an architectural purpose, they're there for something else. But they were very, very engaged in seeing the work that they do, the materials they developed in a very different context, something that they haven't anticipated when they were actually designing these materials in the first place. So I think like really delving into these different disciplines, but not with the attitude that I have a problem, I need you to develop a solution for this, but really looking at what these people are doing and then collaborating with these people has a lot of potential that we're very often underestimating, I think.
So I thought we might move to some questions from the audience, and apologies, we have some issues with microphones, so maybe I can hand this to somebody from my team. They've got one working back there. So just anybody who might have a question for the group that's up here? There we go, we've got two off to the right there. So.
I really appreciated the discussion surrounding uncertainty and intuition, particularly as it was being discussed. I think it was referenced in the sense that uncertainty sort of creates an opening for creativity. I think it was stated like that. And then in a sense, intuition is potentially an area for a solution where that space is created. But for me, both these concepts of uncertainty and intuition really belong in the human realm. So then I was interested by this introduction of the intelligent machine and how that fits in. Machines don't create uncertainty, I think humans do. If you follow this idea that intuition is maybe a solution to this or an answer to this, what's the role, how with man and machine in solution finding? Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, my answer is obviously that I think that the machine can have intuition as well. I don't think that is a uniquely human phenomenon. That's what a lot of my work is meant to try to instill in the machine, if we know what intuition actually is. But I think the other point, there was another point, and I've forgotten what it was actually. So what was the other half of your question? Yeah. I mean, I think that, as I was saying, I think the machine can develop the same kinds of intuition. And by doing so, it's intuition that we use to deal with uncertainty. That's what I was going to say. That we deal with uncertainty specifically. Uncertainty is not necessarily a matter of an inherent property of the world. Sometimes it is. But often uncertainty is just our inability to actually state what we're looking for. And our intuition fills in quite a bit. So my somewhat radical answer is that machines can have this sort of intuition as well.
I think they can work together, and I think what you were touching on earlier, how do we get, Shane, sorry, how do you create an interface where man and machine can coexist? There's a moment where we can sort of engage with this interface to create changes, and I think I think we can't underestimate our intuition, and I think you showed quite clearly that we can understand complex patterns. We recognize the patterns. It's just, it's not about a pencil and paper. It needs to be a different way of looking at problems, and the more we are surrounded by this information represented to us in complex information represented to us in different ways, we'll begin to understand how to negotiate in that environment, and we can cause catalysts. We can start to see formations and understand patterns and suggest that have an influence, and I wouldn't underestimate our ability to read those patterns. And so I think it's hopeful, but again, I think this is going to take a while, and we can't just say that the amount of intuition that goes down on a piece of paper with a pencil. And back to your point, how do we capture that in a new environment, a new design environment? And get the human comfortable with accepting that kind of information and having an impact. Because the other point I'd like to make is that the whole idea about sort of a social, crowdsourced or distributed intelligence or lack of authorship. There's a question there that says, is that actually, these are difficult questions, but do you still need an author? Do you still need somebody to basically cause a catalyst to suggest something to create a following, or can we trust the crowd to actually address what we think is core to our discipline? And that comes back to the same thing: what is core? Because if we don't define that, we're relying on a crowd of people to define it for us.
So it's kind of just a quick comment on this to go back to a few things I've even noticed in practice. About 90% of money spent on technology actually happens in the design studio and the trailer before the building's ever done. That's where the money goes for anything involving technology. However, 75% of the total cost of a building comes from the construction process and the operations afterwards. So if you look at the entire big picture and how much we spend our time on technology, it's just putting together a bunch of drawing sets. It's not necessarily designing what we do within the actual building. So when I start to wonder, you start to think about the opportunities. We talked about intuition in the design process, the computer learning what we want to do and augmenting our design process. When do our buildings start developing intuition so they can understand when things are changing, when the program's changing, and how it progresses after that?
Another point, I do remember my other point now, which is actually that people aren't as unpredictable as we all tend to think, depending on the way at which, the level at which you represent the people and the way you look at them. Crowds, for instance, tend to be much more predictable. The space syntax research I showed was all about the fact that we can predict where people are going to go, not individually, but as a group. So there are levels of predictability, and the same goes to how we understand people in buildings as well and how they can react. But
do we want to live in predictable cities and buildings? That's the question, right?
There's another question out there. There you go.
I guess, yeah. The question here is, do you consider uncertainty, and I think I sort of do, as an excuse for just to resist the natural resistance to change? I mean, that change that, you as an architect, if I get rid of the uncertainty and I'm going to change, the computer's going to do this, my role, what I've traditionally learned, what I've spent my life doing is now different. If I lost the meaning or if I lost the purpose for me being in it. In other words, everything's uncertain. The only thing really certain is everybody resists changing their lifestyle. They like everything else to change. But what happens when it becomes a point that I can't tell the architect from the engineer, from the pharmacist, from the, it's all blended together sort of in the old Leonardo da Vinci Renaissance man, where I use the technology to do what I want to and pursue my whim, let alone, rather than pigeonhole or define it into a profession or a tradition, that's gone back thousands of years.
It is kind of an interesting question, I guess. You were talking about, being unable to distinguish between these different professions, everything being very loose, a little bit over here, a little bit over there. I mean, I guess I'm finding is this, the whole question about authorship and individuality and collective groups. One of the things that you see, so there's a piece written by, I think it was by Paolo Tombesi about how labor works in architecture and the modern change of labor. And it starts to actually look a lot more like agile software development. Lots of quick delivery moments of groups of people getting together and getting something out there. And it's not about, I'm the architect with my big fat red pen and making my thing down there. So it's, at a certain point, I would find that the groups of people, and this is, I guess, a question for you to maybe kind of augment this, do we feel that working in larger groups in collaborative capacities allow us to actually address the issues of uncertainty both in design and in building in the environment, because we're actually getting a collection of opinions from a collection of different people of experiences? Is that something that you see as enabling the opportunity to decrease uncertainty but also exploit uncertainty as a design feature?
Well, I think you have to have clearly defined roles. I mean, otherwise it's too many cooks cooking the same. I don't know, there's a German saying for that, I don't know in English, but I think once you have clearly defined roles, then there's also defined responsibilities and shared responsibility, and then it's much easier to collaborate and to work together and to solve these issues. Yeah, I think that would be my answer.
I'm not sure that the roles need to be clearly defined, though. I mean, I'm thinking actually, you spoke a lot about what's happening with generation, whatever it is that we're getting into now, where everyone is so connected digitally. And I don't know that I understand what the social structure is like there. I know that part of the advantage of not being able to connect to anyone anywhere in the world is that you do have, you're in touch with people that you are, that are locals. So they have different points of view. Now, when we can choose to form a community with people that are anywhere around the globe, there's a chance that we're only forming communities with people that have exactly the same points of view as we do. So I don't know whether we're moving to a sort of, a utopia where we're exposed to lots of different opinions, and so we're much more creative and much more able to deal with things like uncertainty, or are we coming to a point where we're actually forming communities where everyone thinks the same as we do? So I'm not sure I'm not sure which of those two routes or how much of each we're going toward. But I'm also not sure, because I'm not sure of that, I'm not sure how I would organize it, whether clearly defined roles or lots of roles that are constantly in flux. But
common interest doesn't necessarily mean you have the same role as well.
no. No, but it probably means that if you, it potentially means that if you associate with people who have the same common interests, your interests are generally, in other matters, are going to converge more and more the more you associate with them. And the less you have contact with people who are essentially random, who you might not otherwise have contact with, the less chance you have to challenge those ideas. Potentially. I'm not saying it's the case. I don't know anything to back it up or refute it. But all I'm saying is I don't know.
Well, maybe briefly, I think it's knowing that there's other people out there who think similar to what you're thinking, even though they might not exactly think the same way, but with these online things, I mean, if you have 1,000 friends on Facebook, that's really empowering, I think. Even if in reality you probably don't have that many friends, but it makes you feel much stronger, and I think that's also one of the potentials of these things. Not that they necessarily need to work with all of them, but just knowing that there's other people who think similar.
I mean, certainly a larger community. I mean, obviously, it's more robust. You've got robustness. You've got lots of people to cushion the blow if uncertainty should happen. But if you all think the same way, then you run into a real problem, because then you're going to end up in a space that can't deal with uncertainties. It's about diversity of opinion, I guess, within the group, within the social group, whatever it might be. The more diversity you have to cushion the blows of uncertainty, the more people you have with different roles within an organization that designs, the better. But whether those roles are defined in such a way that they make the structure more or less rigorous, I guess that's the question. Well,
I think we have another question up there. We probably will. Oh, there's another one here. I think probably these will be the last two ones for the session.
Press the button on the microphone.
So I
if anyone has... Oh, there you go. Wow. If anyone has any comment on the kind of influence on the fairly recent possibilities opened up by synthetic biology, for instance, in terms of uncertainty, when you synthesize through PCR methods genes, you can calibrate a certain amount of noise in that to sort of simulate mutations and those things that would happen in nature, as to not get a huge set of two perfectly copied genes, which normally wouldn't happen over time. And in general, like, biology is that very messy field which never yields those precise results. That is exactly maybe what we want to get away from when we try to deal with uncertainty. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that, being that it's a subtopic of the session.
I mean, we were going to have initially somebody who was going to talk about that who couldn't come. So in a way, the synthetic biology side was sort of left slightly out. But maybe what I could say, which I found very interesting when Michael Hansmeier came to give a talk at the Bartlett a few months ago, was the fact that after his whole presentation, where clearly some of the formations that he was sort of presenting had a biological similarity. But at the end, when he was asked whether this was sort of a purpose, he said, no, there was absolutely no purpose. It sort of, that was generated in this manner that ended up being like these dinoflagellates that are sort of plankton cells that simply look like that. And what I found, in fact, really interesting was the fact that there was a relationship between the cellular conversation he was having and the cellular conversation that biologists have. With the difference that the subdivision, geometric subdivision that Michael Hansmeier was talking about was not necessarily the differentiation, the programmatic differentiation of cells that happens in nature. Now, it's very possible that we might be moving in that direction. Obviously, what is quite extraordinary about that is that you really could then start thinking that the pre-programming of these cells that differentiate into different specific organs or parts of materials are then predicted beforehand in order to become like that. But this is not where we are right now. This is still on a sort of simulation stage, but not materialized into materials. But clearly a sort of similarity. And in fact, the idea that geometry is not based on lines, but it's a cellular principle is in itself a very similar, comparable system to the biological realm. I'm not answering exactly to your question, but I'm just taking the opportunity to talk about something that probably would have come in if Rachel Armstrong would have been here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to be a bit careful. I'm lucky my wife's not in the audience. She's a geneticist, so anytime architects talk about biology, she gives me a really hard time afterwards. But what I find fascinating about this is I actually have to admit, spent a lot of time in the backyard of where we live, helping her study for her board exams. And one of the interesting things about it was discussing this exact issue of how the starting point of certain cells then become, fulfill what it is they're supposed to be doing, the relationships with each other, and how it starts to build out as it starts from a very simple subset of instructions. And what just came to mind a second ago is then you start looking at what some of the guys at Chicago and a few other places are doing with what might be called, say, 4D printing, or basically developing the first initial condition that then leads you to an emergent set of experiences afterwards that might be entirely contextual. So setting up the initial set of rules, whether it's based upon material relationships, structural relationships, programmatic relationships, and then allowing you a malleability with there that is entirely contextual. And I think that is where I start to get really interested in the opportunities to start exploring ideas of synthetic biology and biological systems applied to uncertain and changing contextual conditions. So I'll hand it to these guys to actually talk a bit more, and then we've got one other question.
Well, I'd just like to say something to Hansmeier, since I think I can say this because he's my colleague. So it's not a coincidence that the forms that he produces look so natural. I mean, he's choosing them. 90% of what his algorithms produce are noise, where we then come back to this idea of intuition and aesthetic, that he he deliberately picks forms that he knows are familiar with him, and that's also, I think, something that we as architects always do. That's why a lot of these things that we design look so natural or biological, even though they don't necessarily need to look like that.
Sorry, again, exactly. I think if we, as long as we're setting our own rules and we're developing our own approach, and if it happens to look like something in nature, then maybe that's a clue to something. But I don't think we should be working the other way. I don't think that should be our starting point.
I don't really have an answer, but I'm just thinking about two things that are useful to keep in mind that differentiate biology from architecture. One, both of which we tend to fall into the trap sometimes, I think. One is that nature does have one single code, one genetic code that it uses over and over again to create life. And actually, we don't have that at all. I mean, this is my argument about having lots of different representations. We can tend to fall into the trap, I think, of saying, well, this is the mode of representation, this is the mode to generate the building, this is the mode to analyze the building, but actually, architecture is far more complex than that. The other thing that nature has is a lot of redundancy. You've got millions of cells. It doesn't matter if each one actually does make it to the right point in this sort of space of possible solutions. You've got a lot of backup systems, a lot of redundancy to sort of take care of that. And both of those principles, I think, are useful principles to keep in mind when we're designing buildings, either to differentiate ourselves from nature, but also to learn from it.
Following up on the idea that perhaps maybe at some point machines can become like humans, or perhaps maybe they can develop intuitions like humans. I humbly and politely suggest that there might be a risk of overestimating with this theory, overestimating what a machine can do, and perhaps even underestimating the qualities of humans. Simply because if we're talking about mechanical machines, mechanized machines made of pieces of metals and titanium and so on and so forth, obviously they're not made of the same nature as we are. As humans, we start off being children, and then we become teenagers, and then adults, and then middle-aged, and finally we become elders, and so on. So our maturity is not just due to our experience, but also our maturity is due to our biological changes. And I don't see that happening yet in machines, and I think many scientists have come to realize this fact, and therefore they're starting to look at genetic engineering as an alternative to artificial intelligence, because it is something that perhaps maybe will enable them to produce humans, cloning other potential human behavior that they're looking for. But the other thing also, why I don't think this is going to be possible at some point with mechanized or computer, let's just say, driven machines, is because not only that we are developing as humans, let's just say you're the scientist studying human behavior. You yourself as a scientist, you're developing and you're changing, and therefore your perception of human behavior is changing throughout time. But also whoever you are studying, be it a group of people or be it an individual, is also developing and changing with time. Therefore, not only you're trying to hit a moving target, you yourself are a moving shooter. And then you may go on into things more deep, like conscience, like, for instance, do you have desires, are there compassion, mercy, and so on and so forth. Things that vary a lot from culture to culture, from person to person. And then you start thinking, how can I possibly make a machine think in this way when you yourself don't have a fixed benchmark to relate it to? I don't know, maybe it's a statement and both a question. Do you think this is the case or not?
I guess that's me. I'd love to have a long conversation about debating whether it is possible to have real artificial intelligence, but I think that's just between you and me, and maybe we can have it later. It's not really relevant to everyone else, I think. But the point was actually that, it's more the point about intuition, that if we can, and I think we can create a machine that does learn. A lot of what you said is about learning. We can create a machine that learns, and we can also develop a machine that does have intuition in a lot of the same ways that we have intuition. We may call that thinking, we may not. But if we can do that, then we can create a machine that, the point is it's not necessarily going to think exactly the way we do as biological agents, but it can think in a similar way, and we can use that to think about things that we are incapable of thinking about, things at a larger scale, things that our brains have not evolved naturally to do. That's my point, and it essentially extends our ability to make those kinds of decisions.
Thank you.
But there are a whole lot of questions about how we would use that in the context of practice that I didn't get into, and there probably isn't time to now.
I think we are probably going to wrap up. We have an exhibition opening waiting for us in Waite's house. I would like to thank, obviously, the speakers and panelists for this session. I think what was interesting was that rather than coming to a conclusion, it was sort of this set of issues launched that probably need a broader, longer conversation. We probably will have some drinks today and tomorrow to debate them in more detail. One thing I wanted to say is that I just remember that an architect, an American architect who's rather forgotten nowadays, called Bruce Goff, in his 50s, when he was a director of the School of Oklahoma, gave a talk in which he was questioning geometry. He being one of the sort of geometry freaks of the time, but he was really questioning it. And one of the things he was questioning was whether we were too small or not advanced sufficiently to understand what was something beyond geometry. Now, this is called smart geometry, so I think it's all to do with that. And is there a paradigm of the beyond geometry that we need to start looking at? Is even this cellular conversation one of the first steps which goes beyond the Darcy-Thompson sort of understanding of geometry and its influence from biological paradigms on architecture? On this note, I finish and invite you to and welcome you to Waite's house for the exhibition of the workshops.